Hello, Nason Rafati from Crisis Group. For the first question for this American election, how important is it for an American voter something like Iran deal or in general, even Iran-US relationship?
I'd make a distinction between, what the average voter is necessarily interested in and what impact the election results have on Iran policy. When it comes to U.S. policy towards Iran, it seems like this will quite likely be a very important election. Whether we see the continuity of the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration has had over the past few years, or whether under a Biden administration we start to move back towards some kind of diplomatic re-engagement of Tehran by Washington.
So what is important for Iranian side, it's will Biden be able to lift sanctions in the first 100 days or of his presidency? At the same time, do we know that the White House now is passing laws to make all difficult to lift or lift sanctions against Iran?
Well, I think you've put your finger on an important point, which is that for the moment, the Trump administration, which has been pursuing this maximum pressure policy, is trying to max out the maximum pressure campaign. Mm-hmm. So what we've seen over the last few weeks, we've seen tranches of major new sanctions against Iranian banks, sanctions against Iranian shipping companies, sanctions against Iran's petroleum sector. And some of these sanctions are redundant. They're building on entities that are already sanctioned, but what they're doing is adding new authorities. So making them linked to terrorism issues, for example, rather than just counterproliferation or human rights designations and so on. And the idea here is to make it more complicated for the Biden administration to lift those sanctions if it wants to. In terms of can it, yes, the Biden administration could go back and lift some of the sanctions that the Trump administration has brought on, many of the sanctions the Trump administration has brought on. But the question is going to be, in what sequence, at what political cost domestically, in what sort of framework of conversation with Tehran in this process. So you mentioned, 100 days. Certainly the devil is in the details of how the re-engagement would happen. There's certain things that a Biden administration would be able to do on day one. There are many things that will require a more bureaucratic process that could take weeks, could take months until we see if that's the intent of going back to pre-US withdrawal. It would be a fairly complicated process, but ultimately doable if the will is there.
So, but on other side, if Donald Trump wins, will it be possible to reach an agreement with Iran? Like he has said many times that in the second term of his presidency, he will negotiate. He said Iranian will negotiate with me in the second term. Is it possible?
Well, certainly the argument that you hear from Trump administration officials is that the maximum pressure campaign has had an impact on Iran. And I think that if you look particularly at Iran's economy over the past 3 years, that impact is certainly there. Iran is now has had 3 years of recession in a row, and a lot of that is because of the impact of U.S. sanctions. What we haven't seen is a diplomatic track that would result in the U.S. and Iran engaging on some of the U.S. demands that the Trump administration has met. And what the Trump administration's contention is that this policy has been in place for 2.5, 3 years. Once the Iranians see that we're back in office, once they see that they have to contend with another 4 years of this kind of pressure, Tehran, this is the Trump administration's argument, Tehran will see that it won't be able to survive for another 4 years under the current circumstances, and that at some point, whether it's in the first few weeks, as the president has said, or a little bit longer, eventually Tehran will realize that it has to renegotiate based on U.S. demands. So that is the Trump administration's case.
As we know these days, many Iranians, not just Iranian people, but from Iranian government, businessmen, factory owners, a lot of people just suspended everything and waiting for these November 3rd elections. Why this election is so important for Iranians this time?
Well, the maximum pressure has very much defined the arc of U.S.-Iran relations over the past 3 years. And the main tool in the maximum pressure campaign has been unilateral economic sanctions. And despite the fact that they are unilateral, they have been extremely powerful. If you look at Iran's oil exports over the past few years, they've gone from the millions to the hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. If you look at Iran's currency, it has dropped significantly over the past couple of years, even over the past few months. Then internally, you obviously have the impact of the coronavirus, which has also impacted Iran quite significantly. It has one of the highest rates in the region, and it has, again, exacerbated some of the economic trouble that the government has faced over the past several months. So the prospect of this kind of web of sanctions continuing to be spun by Washington, or seeing, on the other hand, some sort of diplomatic re-engagement that could lead to greater economic performance, to some degree of oil exports, to some degree of regional trade, to some degree of banking. Those impacts are quite significant for the Iranian government and for the Iranian economy as a whole.